There is a very true saying: the best way to survive a plane crash is not to be in the plane. A joke, if you will, that is as lame as it is accurate. However, if you want to travel for business or pleasure, you need to get on a plane. So recently, the world just witnessed a truly horrific plane crash of a Boeing 787 in India. A crash that surely should have claimed all lives on board. Yet one man, a British national of Indian origin identified as Vishwash Kumar Ramesh, not only survived this tragic crash with minor injuries, but as you can see, he literally walked away from an unsurvivable disaster. Was it a miracle? Fate? Divine intervention? Or maybe he had a secret premonition on where to sit on the plane that day that would save his life. Well, as miraculous as his survival is, it has happened a handful of times before in history where one sole survivor has lived to tell the horrific tale. A few have even fallen thousands of feet after being thrown clear from an aircraft to land on the earth below and survive. So how did Vishwash and the other past sole survivors survive these crashes? And is there something you can do the next time you board a flight to better your odds of surviving? Well, there are statistics and there are facts. First, let's start with the statistics. Statistically speaking, the best part of the plane to be in to survive a crash is in the rear or at least behind the wing. In a 2015 FAA-funded study published by Time magazine that analyzed 35 years of crash data, found out the following about the passengers who have survived serious air crashes. Passengers in the rear third of the aircraft had a 69% survival rate. Those over the wing or middle third had a 56% survival rate. And passengers in the front third had a less than 50% chance of survival at a 49% survival rate. Okay, so then why is the rear safer, as if that question isn't already obvious? Well, in many crashes, especially nose-first impacts or runway overruns, the front of the plane, of course, bears the brunt of the force. And usually that force is quite brutal, extreme, deadly, and complete. However, rear sections may remain more structurally intact or experience less intense fire and explosion risk immediately after impact. Some other factors that affect your chances of survival are seat location relative to exits, especially emergency exits. Again, I know, things we've all heard before. But the closer you are to an exit, the higher your chance of escaping after impact are. And in fact, in this most recent case, the Air India survivor was seated in seat 11A, which just happened to be next to an emergency exit. So did that help him survive? Well, more on that in a minute. But aircraft survivability drops the further you are from an exit due to smoke, fire, or debris. So that brings up the age-old question, aisle seat versus window seat. Well, for obvious reasons, aisle seats allow faster evacuation. While it's true window seats may offer more protection during impact, however, it decreases your exit time and ability to escape exponentially. And what about the brace position? A position discovered by accident, by the way, after a nauseous New Jersey flyer kept his head down during a crash simply because he felt sick and thought he was going to throw up. He was the sole survivor of that plane crash. And soon after, the FAA and NTSB took note and adopted a form of that as the brace position. That's a true story. Look it up. Nevertheless, adopting the proper brace position as instructed by the flight crew significantly increases chances of survival. So remember, if the plane is going down, keep your head down too. Okay, so we still haven't gotten to the facts yet, but we will because there is really only one fact. But we'll get to that in a minute. But keeping with statistics, that brings us to the aircraft type and the crash scenario. For example, in tail strikes or rear impact crashes, front seats might fare better. However, in mid-air breakups or water ditching, survival depends more on structural breakup and flotation. Some notable examples I can share are the one in 1989 United Airlines Flight 232 Sioux City. Most survivors were seated in the rear. But in the worst crash in the history of aviation, the 1977 Tenerife disaster, front passengers had much lower survival rates due to the nose-first explosion. Then you may remember back in 2013, Asiana Flight 214 in San Francisco, when the rear fuselage of the 777 hit first, yet survivors were scattered throughout due to sliding impact and breaking apart of the plane. However, sadly in that case, one young survivor thrown free was eventually killed by a fire truck after her body was hidden on the ground under the fire retardant foam. So those are the statistics. The rear of the plane is the safest, followed by the midsection, and the nose is the worst, with a less than 50% survival rate. Okay, so then tell me, Mr. YouTube Aviation Channel Science Guy, what's the answer? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the answer is also the fact. And that fact is your chance of surviving an unsurvivable plane crash boils down to one solid, undisputed fact. And that fact is luck. Yep. Sorry to disappoint you if you were waiting for a more scientific answer. But just like everything else in life, it's all about luck and timing, or being in the right or wrong place at the right time, if you will. So bringing this video full circle back to the June 12, 787 crash in India, how did Vishwash Kumar Ramesh survive? Well, the honest answer to that question that he himself so far has said he has no idea, and scientifically the experts are saying he should have never survived that crash that they are calling an unsurvivable crash. So in his case, as in all the other examples I have cited, boils down to the fact, and that fact is luck, and the right place at the right time. From all the video and photographic evidence so far we've seen, due to the stalling nature of the crash, the 787 came down in a nose-up, tail-first basic position. So off the bat, that's bad news for anybody sitting in the rear of the plane, as you can clearly see the tail section basically unscathed, wedged in the roof of this medical school. However, because of the angle of the crash, after that, the main body of the plane basically did a belly flop on the roof of the college, with its forward momentum scattering the debris in what was left of the fuselage about 400 feet further along, where it finally erupted in a massive fireball. So given our crash scenarios, a tail strike first crash increases the odds of those in the forward section of the plane to survive. But that begs the question, why did nobody else in the forward section of this crash survive? Did the fact that Kumar Ramesh seated in 11A near an emergency exit play any role? Well, until there is any actual evidence or Kumar can remember himself, we really won't know that. Still, if that were the case, surely his seatmates would have survived along with him. No, sadly, the only plausible answer that makes any sense is just luck or fate. And some may call it a miracle, but I cannot. A miracle would be if everybody survived, but that wasn't the case. But somehow during the violent and horrific flaming crash and violent thrashing of what was left of the Boeing 787, Kumar was simply, by fate or luck, thrown clear from the carnage, leaving him the sole survivor to walk away from this terrible tragedy. And I guess it all depends on your own personal mental state after that, whether you regard it a blessing or a curse being the sole survivor. But that's a question for another day. You know, one of the main reasons people are afraid to fly is the lack of control they have on any outcome. Every time we board an airliner, we are all along for the ride and subject to the will of the physics of man, machine, and gravity. And that scares us because we like to be in control of our own destiny. However, sadly, life isn't like that. So in the end, the odds and statistics tell you the back of the plane, an aisle seat, or near an emergency exit are all great places to start. But in the end, it will always come down to one undisputable fact: luck.